So Riot. Anybody play with Riot? Nobody? Okay, I got one back there. All right, well, and this will be new to you. Okay. Here I am standing up here with yet another JavaScript framework. It's not like we don't have a bunch of them already, right? I think I've talked about Angular. I've used a couple other ones. Anybody messing with some fun frameworks? Anybody doing like Mithril or Elm? Aurelia. Okay, you're playing with Aurelia. I've messed with that a little bit. And yeah, there's just a lot of different stuff going on right now. And it's a good thing. Gives you lots of options. And I think mostly what's happening here right now is we are an industry are trying to figure out a little bit how to write front ends. And we keep coming up with what we think is the right answer. And then 6 months later, someone says, oh, that's cute, but what about this? And then we get these other things happening. So without further ado, I'll show you Riot. That's a Riot component. That's a to-do app. I'll give you a moment to look at that. What I like about Riot is that I don't really have to explain much. In fact, I could probably end the talk right here. You know most about what you need to know about Riot at this point. It looks a lot like HTML and JavaScript, and that's because that's what it is. It's got a little bit of syntactic sugar. It reminds me of when I used to write something called dynamic HTML. Remember that? Yeah, it was. Looks a lot like that actually, but it has a couple of interesting ideas going here. One, you've got a component, a custom tag, a to-do tag, right? So I could use this component in a web page by just saying angle bracket to do now and do a mount on it. It's mostly stuff you already know. There's not a whole lot to learn. There's just a little bit of icing on it. We'll come back to this in a moment, but when I first saw this is kind of how I felt. It's like a breath of fresh air. It was just like, wow, can it really? Because if you have ever done something like Angular or Ember or even Backbone or Knockout, I mean, it's messy. Even React is kind of messy with JSX, right? You start out with JavaScript first, and then you start decorating it with HTML. And Riot kind of comes from the other end.
Excuse me, I have a question.
Yeah.
In your example, when you put the script with the HTML, is that the convention, or is it just because you want to show a small?
That is the convention, actually. It's actually the React convention, too, if you think about it. React, you write JavaScript and you put your HTML in it, right? Riot, you write your HTML and you put JavaScript in it. I gave away part of my talk already, but since you asked, I had to. Yeah, so it kind of inverts the pattern. But really, why a new library? Well, they liked React. They liked what they saw in React, but basically they didn't like JSX. And I don't really like JSX either, which is why I like Riot. So they came up with this idea of a lighter weight, easier to grok thing. And the beauty of it, too, is it's a lot smaller, as you'll see in a moment. Thing I like about it the most is it's human readable. Anybody guess what this does? Yeah, I don't think it'd be too hard, right? If I asked you to add a word cloud to this, if I came up and said, hey, add a word cloud to this, I think most of you might come in and say, all right, well, maybe I'll write a custom tag called form-word cloud, and maybe I'll put it in here, or maybe I'll put it in the sidebar component. I don't know where it would go. But it's easy to compose these things and reason about them right away because they're just tags. They're components. They have a lot of logic and stuff behind them. But you can kind of deal with them at a high order level. Despite looking simple, it's actually fairly sophisticated. It has a virtual DOM. So you get the same benefit of React of being able to just render your view straight up, and the framework figures out how to update the DOM in the most efficient way. It also has one-way data flows, another React sort of thing that we'll talk about a little bit later. And it can do server-side rendering. That's always the other thing people ask me right away. It's close to standards. There's really, it's a very thin coating on top of HTML and JavaScript in a way. There's no proprietary event system. The rendered DOM can be manipulated with other tools. You can use jQuery or Lodash, whatever you want. Well, Lodash doesn't do DOM, but you can just use any tool you want. As you can see, there's not a whole lot of decoration you have to add or attributes or to your HTML. You don't have to, like in Angular, you have that root element thing, data attributes. They eliminate most of that. Whoops. It's tooling friendly. Use what you want. Use ES6, TypeScript, CoffeeScript. I've used ES6 and TypeScript with it. It works just fine. I've used Webpack. I haven't used Grunt or Gulp with it, but again, it's very neutral about these things.
And you say you use TypeScript with it, but I'm curious because to me one of the big advantages of the combination of React and TypeScript is the fact that you can statically TypeScript your templates all the way down.
Yeah.
Does it provide that same functionality somehow?
Yes and no. You'll see what it does with this in a moment. You'll find out this is just JavaScript under the covers.
So it generates the JavaScript and then it checks the JavaScript.
Right, exactly. So this is really just a really nice syntactic layer over a very small library. Yeah, and it's a small learning curve. I mean, there's only, I think, 12 APIs in the whole thing. Size, it's really small. 8.6 kilobytes gzipped. 8.6 kilobytes gzipped. That's just minified, but if you also gzip it, it's about 8.6 or 8.7. Used to be 3.5. It's actually kind of gotten fat, you know. It's kind of put on some weight. But they're doing some cool stuff now, like multi-transclusion and stuff. So they've added some features that. Okay, so as promised, here's our to-do app again. Take a look at that. There's some interesting points here. Like one of the things I really like is that you can put your styles right in line here, and they're scoped. And it'll inject them into the head.
Does it inject them as is, or does it qualify them so that they only apply to
Yes and yes. If you use scoped, it'll qualify them. Right.
Oh, I see. I didn't.
Yeah. If you don't, then you can just use there's a couple different ways you can do it, but yeah, they are scoped. Yeah, so good question. And this is how you'd use it, right? So obviously that's just how you define the tag, and this is how you would use it. So basically, I would have my JavaScript, that to-do that I showed you would be this to-do.tag. The convention is to use .tag. Compiler really doesn't care. You can use HTML or JS extensions. There's the Riot code, and you mount it just like you do in React. Party on. That's what it looks like. In fact, you can go to riotjs.com, and there's a little playground there. They run the same code that I just showed you on there, so you can fool around with it. There's some other playground apps in there as well. So, compiler. I mentioned something about a compiler. You compile it two ways. There's a command line compiler. That's how you do the server-side stuff, and that's generally how I use this. But for demonstrations, the in-browser compilation is a little easier to. It has a little bit more of a wow factor in it. Do it either way. I think for a project that gets more than maybe 5 or 6 tags, you're better off using some sort of asset bundler and, or Webpack or something and combining it all with tools and linting it like you normally would. But you can do it in the browser. That's to-do compiled. So this, we'll pull back the curtain here, and this is what it generates. It's just JavaScript. Now the HTML here I cut off here at the ... because I didn't want to. But yeah, there's the name of the tag. There's the HTML. There's the style. By any classes, I think they'd go in here. Any class objects, and the generated code. I used to just write it like this, straight up, for a while. I don't know why. I just felt like I didn't need the compiler, but it really is a lot nicer. Compiler's really fast if you want to use the in-browser compiler. They have some numbers up there. I don't know if they're true or not, but basically you don't really have to worry about the overhead of compiling tags unless you got a gazillion of them. Okay, so before we go further, I've been talking a little bit about React. Now, how many of you have been to the React talk that was here? What is it, 3-4 months ago there was a React talk? Is that when it was? Well, how many? 1, 2. Okay. How many of you are familiar with React? Lots of you. Okay, cool. Well, about half of you. Okay. So React. So React came out, what, 2-3 years ago, and they were trying to solve a problem. And this is the problem they were trying to solve. Some of you probably know this story. This is the little chat icon chitlet thing that sits in Facebook. That number was never right. That was supposed to be the number of unread chats. So Facebook, 1 billion people on the planet use it, right? This was their #1 bug. They couldn't get this thing fixed. They'd fix it, it would break. They'd fix it, it would break. And part of the problem was, when they looked at it, is that they're using this model view controller architecture, which is in itself is not bad, but they had all these sort of dependencies. And so you'd change something and it would trigger a change, which would change something, would change something, and on and on. And the problem with that, and it looks pretty innocent when you get started, but after a while, you lose predictability. You can aim that pinball where you want it to go there, but if you don't hit that bumper just right, no telling what's going to happen. So they came up with a solution. I call it a solution because I'm sure a year from now we'll be saying just how dumb React is like we're saying how dumb Angular is right now, right? Because somebody will come up with some other idea. But regardless, the solution they came up with was to write everything as a component, bring their data down from their models, and then use events to talk to their models, or what they call stores. And it's a pretty simple idea, but by having this one-way direction of events and data, it's a lot easier to reason about these things. In fact, when you do that, you can just, your component can just look at a new snapshot of the model and just redraw itself, which is what it does. This is a React component that just took this off their homepage. It's pretty easy to understand, I think. I mean, one of the nice things about React is that you can grok it pretty quickly. And you have this kind of weird construct here where you can put your HTML right in your JavaScript. They call that JSX. It's pretty neat. Here's the same thing in Riot, just as a comparison. Get my little cursor out of the way. Actually, I had to add white space to it to kind of make it fill out the screen a little bit there, right? So yeah, same concepts, same ideas, a little bit different syntax, a little friendlier, a little easier to understand. But if you're updating the view all the time, won't it be slow? And the answer is no, because they have some smarts built in. They have a virtual DOM, just like React has one. The idea is it's a data structure. You write to this data structure, and the data structure figures out the most efficient way to update the DOM. That's all a virtual DOM is. React's virtual DOM is very, very sophisticated. It's also, what, 128 kilobyte library. Riot's DOM, not so much. Riot's makes a few assumptions that make their DOM simpler but not quite as flexible. One of them is you can't change the meaning of a tag. So in React, you could turn an input into a list if you wanted to. Can't do that in Riot. I think that's a sensible restriction, but those are the kinds of things that you get out of it. And the other thing you'll hear a lot about is Flux. So both Riot and React talk about this view layer here. That's really all they address. Somehow you have to manage your data and figure out how to update your models and things like that. That's what this Flux thing is. They came out with Flux and immediately everybody said cool, and then they said, oh no, that sucks, and then they came out with Redux, and there's a few different ways of doing it now. Elm is really pushing this reducer idea that you have a single model and a bunch of reducers that move things. So this constantly moving target here, which is interesting in that, I'll wait on that. I don't want to say that just yet. Never mind. So the lessons from React. It's easier to grok because you can just render your view straight up. You don't have to worry about, like in Angular, you have watchers and stuff, and I'm going to change this whole thing, and that's going to affect that sort of stuff. You just kind of paint your view top to bottom. The DOM figures it out, or the virtual DOM, I should say. Your data flows one way, your events the other. Components rule. This is the lessons that React kind of picked up, or I mean Riot picked up from React. And so yeah, they kind of invert the pattern basically. In React, you have a UI template markup. Your UI template markup is baked into the JavaScript code. Riot just inverts that. I think it's, I find personally it's easier to reason about things using Riot, but Riot syntax. Okay. So, like I said, the problem with this talk is I have to kind of like talk about a lot of stuff because Riot is so dang simple. So, but there are some specifics to the syntax, okay? So a Riot tag is basically what we saw with that to-do, right? Here's the one thing, and I don't have it on the slide here. You've got to start it in column 1. I have no idea why. It's got to be the first, you know, that tag, the to-do tag, that angle bracket's got to be in column 0. Or it just blows up. I don't know why. But it just, and it's baked in. They tell you that in the documentation. So it can be empty. You can have HTML in it. You can have JavaScript in it. Attributes have to be lowercase. That's actually a standard, I think, in the W3C, but they require it. They got some other nice little syntactical shorthands that we'll talk about in a moment. I mentioned this styling, this tag styling. So one of the things that we learned from React was that, you know, like if you're working in Angular or something, they always say, well, you got to separate your template from your code because they're separate concerns, right? React said, no, templates separate technologies, not concerns, because let's face it, the markup for the to-do tag is pretty concerned about the to-do thing. Right? And so is the code behind. And actually the style elements are also pretty concerned about that. So what I like about this is that, and I'll show you some examples of some programs I've written with this, is that you write these really small components that are easy to assemble. You can nest components and stuff. And everything's right there. You don't have to come up with some weird way of bundling your HTML like you do in Angular, or coming up with a naming convention for, you know, so you can find your template, you know, based on the name of your code behind, et cetera, you know. Same thing with your styling. It's just all right there where you can grok it in one shot. Yeah, here you were asking about the styling. So one way you can scope your stuff is just use the custom tag name because it's in the DOM, right? The other way is you can use the style scope thing. Either way, it'll lift that out and inject it into the header of the page. I mentioned you can use whatever you want. They've got a preprocessor step in their compiler that you can wire into. I generally don't do that. I use Babel or Babel. I don't know how you say that. There's some controversy about that. So I don't bother with their precompiler. I use a TypeScript loader or the ES6 loader. But again, use whatever tools you want. Mounting. Okay, you define a tag, you've just defined it. It doesn't exist in the DOM yet, right? You've got to actually tell Riot, this is something I want to put in the DOM. That's what mounting does. And there's several ways to mount. Right, so even though I have my to-do tag here, nothing happens until that guy mounts it. Yeah?
Back to the previous slide. So let's say you want to use ES6.
Yeah, you can just put ES6 in here, but then you have to put an ES6 compiler in a certain place so it can find it. So Riot itself doesn't know how to process any of this stuff. It's just willing to run a preprocessor for you, is really what it comes down to. But like I said, you can also do the same thing with Webpack. or not Browserify, but Webpack, or a Grunt or a Gulp script. People have been doing it for years in different ways. Again, it doesn't really care. Use the tools that you like. At the end of the day, it generates JavaScript. Yeah, some more examples. You can mount alt tags. You can mount them. If you got a tag, if you have a tag with an ID element on it, you can mount it that way. You can mount several of them. There is a little observable built in. It's very basic, but it kind of gets the job done. If you don't like it, write your own or go get one from NPM. They put it in there just to be complete because sometimes you want to communicate between components, and events are a nice way to do it. And it's got typical lifecycle events that you'd see in React, for instance. So I think those are all pretty self-explanatory how they work. They're fairly important, actually, because there's a little gotcha here. So this is why I was saying that nothing happens, almost nothing happens until you mount your tag, right? So this console log, it doesn't really fail. What it'll do is print undefined instead of whatever that find me element would be, right? Why is that? Simply because it hasn't executed until you've done the mount. So that's why you put things that you want to happen when you mount the tag in these update and mount events. I make that mistake all the time still. You can pass options in when you mount your tags. So if you got a little model that goes with your tag, you can mount it that way. And then you can reference them in your tag. So this ops object will be predefined, and it'll have all those items in there. It'll also have, if you define any attributes in the HTML on the tag, so if they said to do, title equals, whatever, there'd be an ops.title in there. So that's another way to get those. Expressions are just JavaScript. If you've ever programmed in Angular, this is one of those things you go, hallelujah, thank you. And I've never been able to figure out what an expression in Angular means because they're restricted. Yeah?
Can you talk a little bit how the compiler works? Like honestly, whenever I see JavaScript or an HTML string being converted to JavaScript, I get kind of worried because Angular has had a bunch of security vulnerabilities because of the way that it's parsed strings into JavaScript expressions. So I wonder if you looked at the compiler and how secure it is.
No, I haven't, frankly. But again, it's just JavaScript. They don't try to do anything funny with it. It really is just JavaScript. So as far as injection attacks and stuff, that's something you're still going to have to take care of. But yeah, as far as I know, it's just JavaScript straight up. The compiler doesn't do much other than translate it into that runtime thing that I showed you. It doesn't try to be really smart about anticipating, all these different things. It really is a, translate it from this to this, do a few sanity checks, done.
How are the diagnostic messages?
Lousy. Lousy. Like I said, if you don't put that tag in the first line, it dumps a whole stack of stuff, and you're like, what, really? And then you move it.
Like if you miss a close parentheses.
Yeah, it'll fail, and it'll tell you the line number and stuff like that. Yeah, but like I said, every once in a while you'll just do something, it'll go west. Not too often though. But like I said, if you're using a watcher, and this works with the Riot compiler comes with a watcher, so you can download the Riot command line version of this. You can say Riot watch, and then when you change your tag files, it'll generate the stuff right away. So you can see your errors really quickly as you go along. Boolean attributes is just a nice little, again, syntactic sugar. This checked guy will go completely away. It'll never be emitted here if it's a falsy value. Yeah, this is another common sort of mistake. Just defining checkbox period as an attribute is enough to make it a checkbox, right? This type, right? It doesn't matter if you do it, you know, have an attribute on it or a equals on it or not. Again, shorthand, this is pretty straightforward again. If it's true or truthy. Does anybody know what I mean by truthy? Truthy. What are the truthy values in JavaScript? Anybody? Everything that's not falsy. Okay, what are the falsy values? That's a better way to answer the question. Falsy values. Okay, what is it? False.
No, undefined, 0, empty string, and not a number.
No, that's 6 actually. Not a number is actually true.
What about empty arrays not?
An empty array. Is that what it is? It's 0, empty string, right? Null, undefined, and false. There's 5 values. That's it. Those are the only false values in JavaScript.
Such variety.
Yeah, well, you get into the JavaScript is one of these interesting languages. It's very powerful. I mean, it was the first mainstream language to introduce lambdas. Yeah, right into the pop. I mean, it wasn't, you know, there's Lisp obviously, but it was the first popular language that introduced lambda. You know, it has functions as first-class, objects. It has a lot of advanced features. The problem is it has a lot of stupid sharp edges in it too, that can cut you, like this falsy thing. You know, it's a Boolean. No, it's not. It's sort of true or false, depending. JavaScript, the good parts. This is kind of the seminal book. If you haven't read this, please go buy it. It's 90 pages. And this will just expose to you all the horrors of JavaScript. And all the good parts, too. It'll basically, and he has a pretty good motto here. He says, JavaScript is a good language at its core. There's good parts in it. Just use the good parts and ignore the bad parts. You know? I hear that, you know, it's good philosophy to adopt. I hear a lot of people complain about Angular. I get along with Angular just fine. I just stay away from the sharp edges when I can. You can't always avoid them, but most of the time you can. So yeah, in this case, which guys will be defined? Will foo be defined? Yeah, foo will be defined. Bar won't be defined, right? Because it's 0. The other ones will all exist. Ooh, transclusion. For such a little library, it does some pretty cool stuff. So transclusion is just the idea when I define this tag of I got some markup in between, I want to somehow have that markup, be rendered inside the context of whatever my tag does. Angular came out with this, and it was a big deal. Questions on transclusion? Because there's also multi-transclusion. Same idea, the only difference, they're named regions. And so, if you look at here, we're going to have, if I have a title in there, it'll be in the H1. Anything in the yield summary area will be surrounded by an H2, right? And then the content part will be in a div, right? And so if we go, I couldn't get it all on one slide. So if you go to the next one here, here's us using the tag, right? Up here, right? So my summary, I'm passing the title in through the attribute. Remember what I said with attributes, you can define them in the tag and they show up in the ops guy, right? And so what do we expect? Yeah, we got what a great title in the H1. In the H2, we've got that stuff, and in the div, we've got the content. Loops, we've already seen loops, pretty straightforward, each. Pretty much loops over anything you give it. Not sure why I put non-object arrays there, but anyways, you can give it pretty much anything. Here's some array of primitives. It's more than happy to deal with that. You can just loop over them.
In Angular and React, you can do special things to optimize processing
Yeah, that does that here too. Yeah, same thing. So it actually.
But how does it know? We know it provides some kind of ID.
See if I can. It does dirty checking just like Angular does.
No, what I'm
Basically.
talking about is like in React you have this key, or in Angular you have index 5. So the idea is that it can look at two versions of the DOM and it can actually.
Right, and so what it does, yeah.
The same.
Yeah, what they do, yeah, I'm not really 100% clear on it. I think what they do is they generate a hash, and they install it in the DOM, and then they look at it again when they generate this stuff. But I'm not entirely sure, frankly. It does work really well. There's some speed tests that you can go out and look at, and Riot, it's usually right in the middle somewhere. So your Aurelias and your Angular 2s are usually a little faster. Riot usually hangs in there with React, so they'll do like the 10,000 table, cell thing, and then start changing it and stuff, and how fast it can render. You can also do it over an object. Of course, it's not really recommended. It's slow. Order's not guaranteed. Things like that. There's a router in there. I won't talk about it much. I already talked about observables, so let's look at some code.
Does it produce map files for debugging?
Beg your pardon?
Does it produce map files for debugging?
Does it produce mapped files for debugging? Yes, it does. This was taped on the outside of our door where we did our code reviews at Siemens. I just thought it was kind of amusing. Okay, so example 1. I'm not going to show you example 1. Because example 1 is kind of complicated. It does give you kind of a full view of a router, a Flux, using Webpack and NPM, all this tooling and stuff, right? But the problem with this example is that it's complicated because I've got all this tooling and stuff that I have to explain. And I really don't want to do that. So you can go look at it. That's the repository where it's at. Instead, we're going to go look at example 2. Anybody hear of Electron? Yeah, so Electron's this cool idea of writing desktop applications by embedding a browser in a desktop frame and running a little node browser behind it, right? And so you can use all your fun web technologies, but write desktop applications. Visual Studio Code is probably the most famous version of that. Atom.io is another one. I think Slack is one too. Is that right? Yeah. So there's a bunch of them out there, and they look just like desktop apps. It's really kind of a cool technology. It's actually really easy to use too. One of the things that I found interesting about it was that it only took about 20 minutes of fooling around with it, and I had this example working. So, and it has a cool name. I call it Electron Riot. Okay. So let's go look at some code, as they say. So this is the repository for it. You can download it and clone it and play with it if you want. It's pretty easy to understand. What does it do? Let's see here. Yeah. So whenever I encounter a new framework, I always write this little toy application. Some people do cookbooks, some people do other things. I always write this little iTunes browser. I don't know how I got started doing it. When I started fooling with Angular, I did this, and a few other frameworks, Elm, I did this in. So this is my Riot version of my iTunes guy. And so what you can do here is you can type in something like, I don't know, Rick Astley. Right? Yep, and I did. And I go, oh, look at that. Oh, you know what? I think, but yeah, it won't let me do. I think I'm offline, yeah. Connected open. I was running this earlier. Let's see if this is still working. Yeah, see, for some reason I can't get this to, maybe if I troubleshoot that guy. Because I got to show you this word. Cancel.
Captive portal, just see if Google redirect you. Something not secure, like Google.
Yeah, but, oh, I see what you're saying. Okay. Yeah, because you got to do their little. Come on, baby. Yeah, like I said.
It's probably redirecting to
Yeah, go to.
It's redirecting.
Yeah.
You probably got the HTTPS everywhere installed.
Yeah, I tend to do that. There we go. Yay, found one. Okay, so.
You gotta secure your site, man.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a static site, right? So, really. Search. Okay, so maybe if I start this again. Hey, something's working. I got some emails now. Okay. One more time. With feeling. Yay! Woohoo! Okay, so this has got all the basic elements. It's got a form. It's a custom component. Actually, it's made up of 3 custom components. There's this form part up top here. There's this horizontal bar. And there's this list part, right? And you can also, I think, let's try something here. So if I go to, there we go, baby. And now I've rickrolled the whole room. Oh, yeah. Okay. Just to prove to you that it works, okay. Okay, so let's go look at the code for this. So this is a desktop application. And all I really did was I took my HTML that I'd written someplace else and threw it in my Electron app and added a few wrappers, and voila, desktop application. Kind of cool. You get native field components, and there's some style sheets to make it look like Mac or whatever. Electron's a fun technology. I've had a lot of fun with it, obviously. Okay. So let's look. Yeah, we don't look at that. That's all Riot stuff. Index. I'll blow this up here so we can see it. Okay, so there's the main page. Move that up a little bit so you can see it. Right? Just what we've been seeing all along, right? What's interesting with Electron is you can use your node type modules. So that's a nice little extra feature that you get. So you couldn't do that in a standard web page, but you can do it in an Electron page. And here's our little custom tag. Here's our iTunes browser. So let's go look how we define that. iTunes browser tag. I'll give you a moment to digest that. There's my custom HR component right there. But yeah, really, what do we got going on here? My iTunes browser consists of 3 other custom tags, right? I've got my browser form, which was that top part, right? I've got the list, which was the table. And I've got the little media player. So I wrote those as 3 separate components. So you can nest your components. It's a nice way to kind of divide and conquer, right? These are just used to communicate between the components. You could actually use parent tags or stuff like that, but I went the high road and used events. This is just some JSON-P that I needed to go hit the iTunes guy, right? Pretty straightforward. So, and these other tags aren't any more complicated. So if we go look at these, so if we look at the form, the form. Again, this is what I like. I can write mostly HTML, and I get, you know, my editor sees it as HTML, so I get all the nice little hints and stuff, and color coding and whatever. But yeah, it's just input box. This is a little Selection control. Button. And actually the script at the bottom here, there's just a couple of events is all this form has to fire in this case. On search and on filter. I didn't show you the filter, but we did do the on search, so not much script, right? And all it does is trigger some events, right? And those observables are listening up top. The table guy is, the list guy is equally unimpressive. It's a table. I'll give you a few moments to look at that. So somewhere down here, I get the media items will come in. We'll go down and scroll down and look at that. But I get some media items. I filter them. I loop over them. Again, it's mostly HTML. Script is a little more complicated, but not much. Here's my changed event. So what happens is when I press that search button, that JSON-P gets executed, and when it returns a successful result, it fires an event called changed. This guy's listening for it, gets the payload. Then the filtering and stuff is just simple, straightforward JavaScript. Here, because I'm in electronic and use ES6 syntax, and if you're familiar with the arrow, these are just functions. Another way of writing a function. There's a couple of cute little things about this, but they're functions basically. You can get away with that.
So I see it has all this trigger and on stuff for the event system. How would you integrate something like Redux into this?
I do it. That's a good question. I haven't used Redux, so you'd have to. Your Redux guy would have to fire an event at some point when your model was updated, wouldn't it? Yeah. I mean, you'd have to make some adaptation. There are some Riot Redux implementations out there. I haven't looked at them. Like they call it. I think, is it called Retux? Maybe. I'd have to go look. Yeah, they. But there are some people have written some libraries to deal with Riot and Redux out there. Where's our player? Here it is. And finally, our player. I'm just using the HTML5 video tag here, right? So most of this is style sheet, I think. Remember, right? Play, close events, yeah, and then our style. So yeah, it's kind of neat that you can write in just a few lines of code something that kind of looks pretty cool and does something almost useful. Like Rickroll the room. So, questions on that? Anything else? Yeah.
I had just a question about scoping of variables. Each of those components were
They're scoped to the element, actually. So there's an implicit this.
Okay,
Yeah, it's a very good question. So you're looking at that saying, am I actually referencing global space inside that script? No, there's an implicit this in there.
thank you.
And if you look at the Riot tag decompiled, you can see that right away. So again, this is just that sugar that makes it really nice to use. Good observation. I should have said something about that. Of course, there's all sorts of fun little libraries out there, and they have all sorts of fun little names. So there's a Riot control out there that does Flux. I guess it's a Flux controller, right? And Riot Bootstrap and Riot Gear is a bunch of components people have written. Alerts and pop-up bubbles and all those little gizmos that you put in web pages, right? So fancy select controls or whatever. This is kind of an interesting little site. People ask me, well, you know, is anybody using this in production? And the answer is, yeah, lots of people are actually. This is kind of one of my favorite ones because I like weather. In fact, my degree was in meteorology. It wasn't in computer science. So let's zoom in here a little bit. I don't know if you can see those arrows. Yeah, you can't see those arrows moving. This is a nice little wind map. It's all written in Riot. I think it's kind of fun. It's fun when you get like a hurricane or something out here. You'll see. See if that semi-permanent low is out there. So, yeah, so there's something nasty going on over here, obviously. Right? Is that off of Spain? So maybe this is a future hurricane forming out here. I don't know. Anyways, I think it's just kind of fun. So people actually do real useful work in this framework. It's true.
Where's the data come from?
Oh, it comes from a number of sources, actually. I think they get it from Forecast.io is one of them I know they use. And Forecast.io actually is a, it consolidates about 10 other feeds out there. So, before I go, oh, look at that. Yeah, I just touched that and it went away. Isn't that nice? See if that comes back. Maybe it'll come back. Yeah, okay. So I spent a little time talking about this framework, and I asked you earlier whether you're using other frameworks and stuff. And you know, the fact of the matter is I don't expect you to go home and start writing your apps in Riot. That's not why I'm up here. The reason I'm up here is to sort of show you some different things that are happening out there and try to encourage you to just play with this stuff a little bit because you learn things. I learned a lot about Angular by playing with Riot, which sounds a little weird, but I went back and started looking at my Angular code after writing some stuff in Riot, and I realized that I really didn't need external controllers. You know, I could really express pretty much everything I wanted to the way I was writing Angular apps as components. And so I kind of backed off of the whole ng controller thing and started expressing everything in components. And so the reason you want to play with these things is because they reveal patterns to you, right? And these aren't the only guys in town. So like, you know, you're talking about small libraries here. You know, this looks really small, all right? These are just a couple that came out in the last week. Here's one called Preact. All right? This little puppy comes in at what, 3 kilobytes? Look at this. It has the more familiar JSX syntax if you like that, right? So a lot of people are fooling around with these micro libraries and coming up with some pretty interesting ideas. They're kind of taking that kernel of an idea in React or Angular and reforming into something that's a little easier to digest and use. Trying to think, another one just came out. The name escapes me now. What's that? Yeah. Yeah, so the support, right? It's an open source project. I didn't mention that. So it's totally open source. As far, no longer MUUT, I don't know how you say that. No longer, they developed it, but then they kind of just gave it away to the open source community. There's a fairly active community. You can go to their Gitter feed, and there's usually at least 100 messages a day on their Gitter feed, and they're constantly logging and doing bugs. They have a release right now about every 5 weeks. So as they find stuff, they're also refactoring the library again because you know, they're discovering patterns and ideas, and people are coming back and saying, well, yeah, this is nice, but this is broken. And so they're kind of taking a step. They actually had React 1, which was dependent on jQuery. And then that went away. They came out with React 2, which was a lot smaller and neater. And now they're working on React 3. And apparently they've got some, because they've run into some issues about the way they're doing loops in particular that they can't really resolve without breaking it. So they're just going to come out with a new version that is not forward compatible or backward compatible, I guess, with 2. So, so yeah, to answer your question, how responsive are they? They're responsive. I don't find that I run into a lot of bugs in this library because it's so darn simple, but it kind of depends again. I tend to use the good parts. I tend to kind of stay in the middle and not push things too hard. if a lot of the bug reports I see in there are things like, well, yeah, why would you want to do that to begin with? You know, but you know, everybody has their way of doing stuff. So. Oh, runtime error. Oh gosh, I totally missed. Okay, so. Yeah, does somebody want to ask the support question? It's not that good. It's not as good as, say, Ember, for instance, or some of these other frameworks. Angular actually has some pretty good messages, too. I would say they're pretty mediocre on that, frankly. But again, look how small they are, too. So, I mean, there's just things they give up for the sake of simplicity and size. So. But it is, too. Like I said, it's only 12 APIs. I think the source code for it is 1,500 lines of code. I mean, you can read it top to bottom in an afternoon, pretty much figure out what it does. So it's kind of amazing that they can express so much in so little. I think that's what's kind of fun about this framework, is they've kind of stepped on Angular and React's toes a little bit by saying, oh, you don't have to be big and heavy. Of course, they don't have all that other stuff that those guys are doing. They're just trying to get at that nugget, that thing that you're trying to do with a view. So. Any other questions? Yeah.
One of the things I have against most modern JavaScript frameworks is that they assume full control of your product, over your page, etc. This looks like something that I can wedge into an existing product. Is that your impression?
Yeah, I get what you're going there a little bit. Yeah, it's my impression. I couldn't say that for certain, but yeah, I suppose you could use this in an Angular app. I don't, you know, it'd be hard to mix two view engines, I think, in the same page. But yeah, as far as the, you know, it's, again, it doesn't really make a lot of demands. You know, you can use whatever tools you want. So yeah, you could do that. You could start wedging it in places. I've heard of people doing that. I personally haven't done that. In fact, I haven't really written a big project in this yet. I was going to do this with a client about 6 months ago, and then at the last moment they decided they wanted Angular. One of their IT guys said, no, Angular. I said, okay, fine, you know, I'll roll with that, but I really wanted to use Riot for that project. I'd have probably a little more experience in it and could answer some of these more technical questions. Question?
Does Riot expect to be the only UI library on the page? For example, we integrated some React views into an existing backbone app, and it worked because React only touched the area that we told it to play with. And that wouldn't have worked with Angular or something, but expected to be the app. Right?
Well, Angular only affects whatever's in its controller region, I thought, but maybe I'm wrong about that. I really don't know. I can't answer that question, actually. I've never tried that, so I'm going to have to punt on that and say, I don't know. I'm so ashamed. So, anything else? All right, well, thank you for coming by.